Great. We're going to get started now, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good morning. My name is Kim Hamilton with the Island Institute, and I'm very, very happy that everyone can join us here today and to host this session under, albeit very, very challenging circumstances for everyone. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Island Institute, our mission is to help island and coastal communities thrive and to share what we're learning here and elsewhere. And this felt like a very good time to begin to share information that we're learning under these very difficult circumstances. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the webinar format, you'll find some information right now on the screen. We will be using a Q&A function, so please drop any questions you have into the Q&A as shown here on the slide, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible here today. So to kick things off, I want to welcome Commissioner Johnson from the Department of Economic and Community Development, Commissioner Keliher from the Department of Marine Resources, and Anne Fuchs, the Director of Mitigation, Planning, and Recovery from the Maine Emergency Management Agency. I really want to thank our panelists today for being available on such a short notice and for taking the time to be with us, knowing that your teams are continuing to assess the full extent of the damage. I don't need to set a lot of context here. I think everyone knows that Saturday's storm compounded the effects of Wednesday's storm, the impact of which had already been declared a civil emergency by Governor Mills, thus opening up the opportunity to access more federal disaster relief resources. We've all seen the very sobering pictures coming in from all across the coast with historic flooding, infrastructure damage, and extraordinary coastal erosion. I surveyed the damage to my own community, Shebig Island, on Sunday, and there are areas of our coastline that are permanently transformed. And so while I want to recognize today that the damage is truly all across the state, our focus today is on coastal damage and the unique impact to communities and businesses and homeowners all along the coast and on islands. I want to start with a bit of a caveat too. We are still in very early days here, and I want to underscore that there's still a lot that we don't know. I know our panelists may not have all of the answers to all of our questions, but they're committed to helping us track down those answers for you. We did think that knowing, being well positioned to access resources is important. We wanted to provide as much up-to-date information as possible to ensure everyone's doing what is necessary in these early days to be in a very strong position. And your questions are going to help us understand what the needs are. I think everyone knows we're also recording today's conversation. We're going to move quickly to share that recording for those who couldn't join today. And like I said, while we may not get to all of the questions, we'll be working closely with the governor's administration on an FAQ document to help answer all of those questions. So with that, I want to jump right in. And the first question I thought we should tackle is just to understand in aggregate how significant the damage is. And Commissioner Keliher, you had an opportunity to see, the damage from the air. And I was wondering if you could share just a little bit about what you saw and perhaps put this in the context of other storms.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Kim. So we flew with the assistance of the helicopters from Maine Forest Service. We were able to put myself and some Marine Patrol leadership, as well as Jeff Nichols, our communications director, and fly a very large section of coast in eastern Maine, Trenton down through the Millbridge area, and then as well as Rockland all the way down to Harpswell. And seeing it from the air is very different than seeing it in the water. So what you can see is really the big impact areas, right? It's what you can't see that was really problematic for me after that particular flight. But the scope of this is really what I took home from that flight. This is From what we saw and from what the reports that we have as far as commercial fishing infrastructure, it stretches from Kittery all the way to Eastport, and the magnitude is different along the coast depending on how a port or a harbor might be facing. Those southeasterly facing ports certainly took it the hardest, but there are areas along the coast. Harpswell is a good example where even on the lee side of the peninsula, these storm surges just totally destroyed wharves. And it's what you can't see that is really problematic and what we're hearing from industry now, which is the wharf may look fine when you're looking at it, but the underpinnings are broken, the pilings are missing. And so, that kind of damage exists coastwide. And is going to be critical to understanding understanding that's going to be critical to understanding the entire amount of damage to our working waterfront.
So I think the takeaway there is there's more to come as we're assessing the damage, right? And
Much more.
Yeah, and Commissioner Johnson and Anne, anything else to add from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think, and this is more your space than mine, but really getting those impact statements in, making sure that people are reporting that kind of damage is really helpful right now. Because to Commissioner Keliher's point, one of the challenges we see at DCD is what are the long-term ramifications of storms like this for the business community and for local communities, and what are the elements that exist to be supportive. So I think these impact statements are really important. As when we have major disasters, the federal government has kind of funding resources and tools, and our ability to qualify for those are really important. And so we want to continue to lean into that and make sure that we get the highest standard that we can get.
So this is all about building the base of information, right, that then gets reported. And anything else to add just on kind of the aggregate?
Yeah, maybe just a little. And I know we're going to get into the specifics after, but as Commissioner Keliher mentioned, Maine Forest Service immediately after the event was kind enough to put a number of people up in the air to get the aerial perspective. And Director Rogers with Maine Emergency Management Agency has been on the ground between Wells and Old Orchard Beach, getting that different perspective. And then our media partners as well with all the imagery have been fantastic. All that stuff has really helped to paint the picture in collaboration with the damage assessment information we've been receiving to date. We're very early in the stages, as you have mentioned. It may seem for a lot of the people on the call who I want to affirm this was a really big event. And we're really seeing a lot of people's stories come in, and it's really registering just how bad things were based on the damage assessment information we are receiving. So thank you for that. But that process is just kicked off. And so we have had an infiltration of information as it pertains to businesses, as it pertains to individuals and households, from primary homes to secondary homes to renters that have been affected by this, and then also public infrastructure as well. So we kicked off what we call our damage assessment phase, actually in advance of the storm. And I'll get into contextually what that looks like, what that means, and the specifics probably with our next question. But we aren't really expecting full contextual information back to the state level until the January 18th, January 22nd timeframe. And I use those dates specifically because the state of Maine Emergency Management Agency set specific deadline dates for our county partners to pass down to the local level to roll that information up to us so we can get that big picture and understand magnitude, scope, and what essentially our next steps will be in this process.
That's really helpful, just setting the timeline and the context, and thank you for that. So let's get into some of the specifics now. And I know our time is going to go so quickly here, but I do think it would be helpful for folks to understand, briefly what the role is of your particular agency or department in an emergency and what you're doing to access the funds. And then we'll turn to how folks should be getting ready to prepare and access those funds. So with that, and I think MEMA is the first line of defense. So let's start with you.
Thank you for that. I'll just clarify, the first line of defense is really, it's the town. I mean, damages and disasters start and end at the local level. And, as these events just kind of increase in magnitude and that local level just becomes overburdened, as we clearly were with these coastal storms twice in a row, that's when, the county level and then the state level respectively start working collaboratively together in support of response and recovery of that local level. So really just high level overview of the state's role in this process. We work with county partners, and by way of our county partners, the local level, all year round, pre-disaster, through the disaster, and then in disaster recovery after the disaster. So clearly we're on the disaster recovery side right now, which is what my team oversees for the state of Maine. And rolling up to this event, we knew it was big coming in. We worked with our National Weather Service partners. We set up a conference call with our county partners. So we all kind of postured accordingly and distributed at that point before the event what we call an initial damage assessment. And that's what Commissioner Johnson and Commissioner Keliher have been kind enough to help us distribute, as well as the governor's office after this event, so that we're able to effectively collect as much information as we can in regards to public infrastructure, business and agriculture damages, and then recorded damages to individuals and households. So we're in now what we call the initial damage assessment phase. Every county has their own respective damage threshold that's set every fiscal year by the Federal Register that they have to effectively meet in terms of proved damages of public infrastructure before the state can take next steps and say, oh, this was indeed really bad, and we need to bring in our federal partners, FEMA, to perform what we call a joint preliminary damage assessment to validate those damage estimates that were put forward by each respective county. So, I mean, I fully do expect for this event that we'll be bringing in our federal partners sooner than later. But in terms of going through that process, first thing is to kind of check the box on, okay, which counties are we including in this next phase by aggregating damage information across each respective county, coastal and inland, and then inviting our federal partners in based on that information to conduct those validations of the damages as they pertain to FEMA's programs specifically. FEMA does run what we call a public assistance program, and that's for public infrastructure damages. A little bit of a misnomer because public assistance, often people think, well, it's for the public, but that's specifically for public infrastructure, seawalls, bridges, roads, culverts, etc. The other portion is what we call individual assistance. It's individual to household type of disaster relief. It's a bit harder for states to meet the criteria for individual assistance, but we're going through the motions right now based on the scope of this event to see if we do qualify for that. I mean, we're looking at things like how many primary homes were damaged, how many of those homes were uninsured or underinsured, what's the scope of damage, is the home majorly damaged, is it destroyed? How FEMA looks at that is probably different than a homeowner would because it's far more sentimental for the homeowner. So we're assessing all that information now, and to kind of lay things out, I would expect we would know which counties will be bringing FEMA in to validate public infrastructure damages and potentially see if we can pursue individuals and households assistance based on that information we're aggregating now. We may have a better idea by the end of this week, but certainly by January 18th and January 22nd, respectively.
Great. And just one question before I turn to the commissioners. One report or two? There were two storms.
Mm-hmm. Good question. So for public infrastructure, to kind of use my words and lay things out as cleanly as possible, back-to-back disasters are very hard for a lot of different reasons. You know, in terms of the EMA community, Emergency Management Agency community, we are cognizant that our federal partners will recognize these two events as separate events. Therefore, we've asked our municipal partners, county and municipal partners, to record specifically municipal damages to public infrastructure separately. It's not as important to refine out that information for individuals and households and businesses submitting. It's certainly very helpful, but is not as dire to get that information separated out. So what we could recommend is just a homeowner or business fill out one assessment, and just within the narrative component, differentiate which damages were obtained for each specific event, and that's good enough for us.
Okay, perfect, super helpful. Commissioner Keliher, how about the role that DMR is playing at this point?
Sure. So in the early stages, the role that DMR plays is really a partnership role with MEMA to help get the word out, so they can adequately assess what has been damaged. So to help assist with the potential disaster declaration on the FEMA side. Beyond that, though, this is, I will say, I mean, this is really new territory for DMR, right? Because we're seeing it at such a scale as it pertains to working waterfront. So we've been in contact with NOAA in regards to potential disaster requests to NOAA. However, all of their the laws pertaining to federal fisheries disasters have changed. We're trying to figure out if this is kind of a square peg round hole situation where usually it's about a resource issue, and we've got a lot of experience with dealing with fisheries disaster from a fish resource perspective, but here we're talking about a loss to access associated with that. So we're trying to understand how that's going to play into it. Our state partners, in particular, our state partners down in Florida, have a lot of experience here. So we'll be spending a lot of time talking with those folks, and we've got calls set up with them today. Beyond that, NOAA does have some programs that we are trying to compile information for, which are something we're hoping will be programs that in the short term could create some assistance. What we haven't heard back is if those programs are actually funded right now. So we've reached out to NOAA, and we're currently in the wait and see mode to hear back from our federal partner. We've also reached out to USDA. USDA may have some assistance there. They're going to get back to us later this week as far as potential programs and some pilot programs that they may have, because obviously the USDA component in food security is a component here. So we're trying to figure out how to make those programs fit as well. And I know Commissioner Johnson will likely talk about Small Business Administration, which is also going to be a key component.
Great, thank you. And Commissioner Johnson, how about from your unique perch? How should they be working with your department?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. As Commissioner Keliher mentioned, right, a lot of this is led by MEMA. We are supporting arms in this moment of making sure that we are trying to capture damage, particularly some of the unseen damage that we talked about earlier, to make sure that we have a good map there. From our perspective, the Small Business Administration and their emergency program is the primary program that likely is the quickest to be able to access. Again, there are steps there. We have to show the impact. We have to get the declaration approved. And then those loans, and those are loans, I will say they are small, they are low interest loans. They mature over a 30-year period. So they're pretty patient capital, and you don't have to pay back in the first year. So we know, right, in this moment, people generally don't want more debt, and that's not their goal. But it is one of the tools that can be available, and it is a little bit more patient capital than maybe what people have experienced in other places. And so they can also turn those fairly quickly in their emergency program. They will put people on site in Maine to help fill out applications and other things. So I would say we don't have timing for that yet, or even approvals for that yet. But that paperwork will be submitted by Anne and her team. We would, as soon as that's ready, we will help communicate that out. And again, we are also looking at, there are a handful of community programs that can support kind of resiliency as part of the rebuilding. And I think we're going to talk about resiliency in a couple of minutes, so I won't go there yet. But there are a couple of community resiliency programs that we want to direct people to as well at the community level.
And I missed the agency there for the 30-year low interest loans. Is that through SBA? Got it.
Yes, it's the SBA emergency declaration loans.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Commissioner Keliher, I'm wondering, are there, you talked about loss of access for fishing, kind of getting a handle on that. I'm wondering if there are other sort of unique considerations for working waterfront businesses, for infrastructure, for public working waterfront. And, I know there's a lot sort of under all of those, but are there special considerations for folks addressing that particular infrastructure?
Well, the immediate consideration right now is for the individual businesses is, can they shore them up in a way that they can provide at least some level of access to harvesters? So that's being worked on right now. Again, more on an individual business basis. I think more long term, the way we're looking at this is, how do we build back in a more resilient fashion, right? I mean, in the face of climate change, in the face of sea level rise, rebuilding a wharf back as it was currently constructed is only going to mean a repeat failure. As I continue to tell industry, this is the new norm. We need to make sure that as we build back, we're building back higher and stronger. And so those are the considerations that we're looking at here in the state. So is how can we build back in a way that is going to be productive and secure for the future? And so those will be some things that we're talking about. The governor has called an emergency meeting with Climate Council for later this month to talk about coastal resiliency. Certainly, Commissioner Johnson and I have been in contact with her in her office about potential state funds. She is looking at those type of options as well. But that's, it's not like there's a lot of bottom drawers full of cash floating around state government, right? So we have to figure out if we are going to be able to provide any funding from a state level, how it can be strategically spent, both short term and long term, with resiliency in mind. And those federal dollars, I'm sure, will come with the same kind of considerations.
And Commissioner Johnson, I'm imagining the same is true for businesses that are looking to build back. Are there kind of resources or support or information as they're looking at more climate resilient sort of reconstruction?
I think that's the intent, Kim. I would say we are, to Commissioner Keliher's point, the governor has convened the Climate Council next week to talk through some of this and to really start finding tools and information that will help businesses make their decisions, right, as they rebuild. What does that look like? I would say Efficiency Maine Trust and some others do have grant programs available to think about, climate friendly heating systems. If your heating system needs to be replaced right now, as opposed to replacing an old system, think about renovating into new, and there are programs that will help make that be even more cost effective. And then for communities, the Community Resilience Partnership Program is currently open. Those applications close in March. And those are really about planning, right? Like, how does the community and its members, so businesses and residents, really think about kind of their long-term infrastructure and how do they work together there? So I would say there aren't a lot of solutions yet. I think we are all looking at, as we make these decisions, let's try to look forward to a more resilient body of infrastructure as we try to go forward, and not, right? There is certainly urgency though, and we want to recognize that too, right? If your home was damaged or your business is damaged, getting it back up and functional is kind of priority one. And we understand that difficult balance for people, and want to be as supportive there as we can be. So working toward those tools as quickly as possible is important.
Just on the Community Resilience Partnership, Island Institute is one of the partners with the state on that. So if folks have questions about that, please feel free to contact us too, and we can help with that. And just turning to you, for homeowners in particular, Are there things that they should be doing sort of immediately to, access resources, get prepared to access those resources?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic and very timely question. And we just recently went through this as well, inland with the December 18th event as well. So recommendations right now for homeowners specifically, whether it's a primary, secondary home, or even a rental unit, reach out to your insurance first. Whether you have homeowners insurance, whether you have flood insurance, whether you have content insurance, that's absolutely step one. And abide by the process associated with your insurance representation. I want to be very clear, this is the most direct and successful way to recover from a disaster event is by way of insurance. If we are able to bring in other resources across time, they're just to kind of fill in gaps. Even if FEMA is able to offer relief, it's just to bring people back to like a stable, do you have shelter? Do you have food? Do you have heat kind of situation? So they certainly aren't coming in to build back. So number one, I want to be very clear, please reach out to your insurance. Second thing is definitely recommend obtaining receipts, pictures, imagery, even video footage of the damages obtained from each respective event, and creating almost a flood folder, if you will. Just accumulate, aggregate all that information into one spot. If resources do come through, it'll be essential that homeowners have the ability to represent what could possibly be reimbursed. Most of the opportunities that come through are reimbursement programs, so make sure to retain all documentation. And then the last thing is, please, if you haven't already, submit that damage assessment information. Doing so, again, is not any guarantee of financial relief. It's certainly not an application for financial assistance, but it just helps us collectively at the state level with emergency management kind of facilitating and coordinating this conversation, best understand magnitude and scope. First of all, what resources we have ready to go to give people, and then also those unmet needs that we need to have continued conversations about. And so we very much realize FEMA is not going to have all the answers for this, even though MEMA works with FEMA. That's why we're coordinating with DMR. That's why we're coordinating with DECD. And I'm sorry I'm using acronyms, but we have economic impacts, we have fisheries impacts, we have small business impacts. So our role in this is going to be to say, okay, business owners go here for SBA, or whatever Department of Economic Development comes up with over time after we have that information. But we're going to help coordinate and facilitate that over time and as resources become more available. But long answer to a short question. To kind of finish that up, just please submit that damage assessment, because that last piece is going to help us to identify what we need to further pursue to help people get relief from this event.
And we'll turn to questions in just a second, but we did have one come in that I think is relevant here. And the question is, can we get an extension of the reporting deadline from MEMA? It seems like the current survey deadline is this week. Is that correct?
So the first one tied to January 10th storm was for January 18th. Typically we do a 1 week turnaround, and I'll explain why. And then the second event was for the 22nd, which was a 1 week turnaround from the storm on the 13th. All we're looking to do, we will absolutely accept damage assessment information after those dates. Submitting your information just helps us reach out to you by way of our county and town partners more efficiently if resources do come through. We only push those deadlines because when it comes to a major disaster declaration request, we only have 30 days. And so we need to go through that initial damage assessment phase, which gives us the check mark to bring in FEMA to validate very quickly. So that deadline is just to help us best understand if this is something we need to bring FEMA in for and execute and start moving that very fast moving process. So we will accept damage information after. We just encourage it as soon as possible.
Okay, super helpful, thanks. My last question before we open it up, and I think the answer to this question is not soon enough. But it's when do we expect additional federal resources to start flowing? We talked about several different pots on this call, but I'm wondering, is there a working date assumption around that? And I would open that up to any of you.
Well, I'll just jump in on the NOAA side. Fisheries disasters take a long time. The new guidance that we have from NOAA, I just was receiving information while we've been on the call that they require 12 months of revenue loss associated. So we would have to gather a lot of information over the course of the next year. The same thing's held true on fisheries disasters as well, in meeting a 35% threshold. So that really speaks to kind of an individual loss. So we're trying to understand better on what kind of additional information that we're going to have to obtain from the industry. And so once we get through this initial process that Anne just laid out on the FEMA side, we'll likely have to go back in and extract additional information. So we certainly don't want to do that at the same time and create any confusion of who needs to report where. So it will take time. So and because of that time, we're focused on, is there any other programs that could provide those low or no interest loans or grant funding in the interim. And so we're gathering that information, and we'll get that out through our website as we obtain it.
Okay, great. Heather, Ann, anything else to add just on timelines?
I'll add from the FEMA perspective. We have 30 days from the last day of the incident period for Governor Mills to submit a major disaster declaration request, which would inherently open up public assistance, or if we are validated as meeting eligibility criteria, individual assistance. That one's a little bit harder. So within that 30-day period, with the 30-day period being stated, we'd be looking to submit to FEMA, by way of FEMA, to the president's desk for signature around February 12th. And that's a rough date because we haven't really defined incident period yet. So give me a little grace on that. But we're looking mid next month to probably submit a major disaster declaration request, assuming, we'll be able to move forward. And then after that, it just comes down to how quickly the president can turn around that request for signature. As of the last 5 disasters we've had in the state of Maine, we've had those turned around extraordinarily fast. They've had signatures from the president within about a 2-week time frame. However, Rhode Island, their most recent request took them about 2.5 months. So there's a lot of nuances here, and I just want to be clear and set realistic expectations that a lot of people are hurting. We recognize that. We're doing what we can with the resources we currently have. But as far as the FEMA process, we're looking at about, maybe 2 months out before we're effectively able to bring federal FEMA resources into the state of Maine.
That's just so helpful. So for folks for their own planning can begin to sort of wrap their heads around what that looks like. So thank you for kind of setting those parameters, if you will. I'm going to turn now to questions that are coming in. As you can imagine, we're getting lots of questions about rebuilding in the immediate aftermath. One of the questions we received is for people rebuilding in the same footprint on the working waterfront, including wharves, et cetera. Do they need official permitting if they're building within the same footprint?
Oh, I thought Pat was coming on to answer, Commissioner Keliher was coming on to answer that. Do you have an answer to that? And if not, we can try to get it and get back to you.
I think we could circle back with an official answer.
Yeah.
There's a couple layers to building back in the same spot, and they'll all be unique to that circumstance. And so there'll be Department of Environmental Protection considerations, potentially Department of Transportation stipulations, but it really comes down to local building codes as well. So I think what would be best suited doing is kind of refining our answer by pulling all those pieces together and giving it to you, Kim, to distribute accordingly.
Great.
Yeah.
Pat, anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I did hear from Commissioner Loisum at DEP. They do have a permit by rule process, which is a much more expedited process. So they're in the process of trying to they understand they're likely to get swamped here with these type of requests. So they are looking at that. And just to follow on what Heather and Ann said, that we'll have to refine that with some more information from DEP. But we certainly don't want to be a hindrance, especially if it's just to shore up a facility in order to try to get it workable in the interim. So we'll try to make sure that that's not going to be a cumbersome process.
Great, thank you. Somewhat related question. Many towns have had to make emergency repairs to roads and bridges and have ongoing immediate needs to replace current infrastructure to withstand higher surf action. Are there programs or resources available for this? And how should they be working with DOT? And we probably need to get DOT in the mix here, but just, this is a particular issue of folks are having to repair roads and other sorts of emergency, access in the immediate aftermath.
I'm happy to take that one. Municipalities, first and foremost, there's no immediate funding or immediate relief. I mean, these programs are built to be reimbursement programs. So towns are encouraged to do everything they need to do to ensure life safety and personal protection. So there's no standard associated with waiting or not doing something to best posture for potential federal funding down the road. Emergency protective measures, are a part of that public assistance program that I was discussing through FEMA. And so building roads back, performing emergency protective measures when it comes to putting up barricades or rerouting traffic signs, all the way to putting down temporary gravel to permanent construction. All of those are considerations under the public assistance program. So recommendation for a municipality is don't wait on anything. Do everything you need to do to ensure life safety, but just record everything in detail. Record people's time, make sure you have payment policies ready to go, which lays out standard time versus overtime, not to overwhelm at this point. But just receipts, invoices, documentation, pictures, the whole shebang. And you'll be best postured for if we're able to move forward in your county with the public assistance program.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Another question around covering costs for labor costs and repairs, but also the loss of income that many people are suffering because they can't access their place of employment, et cetera. And I'm wondering about recording that information, funds to offset lost wages, those sorts of things. Is this all part of what's to come? Are there any immediate resources?
I guess I can start with this, but if the two of you want to jump in. Kim, there aren't a lot of immediate resources for that work. I would say, back to Anne's point, of track everything, keep track of things, know where they are so that when you need them, it's available. I think we are all trying to find multiple avenues in addition to kind of the traditional FEMA strain there. So I would say well document, keep track of, but there aren't a lot of tools right now available to people for that.
And we will be circulating in the follow-up any links for those forms that folks need to fill out, any helpful resources. So we'll make sure that folks have those. Another question that's come in is, do we have any early estimates of the numbers of businesses affected or any approximation of the overall cost of the damage?
I think it's too early to put estimates forward for cost, but I do think they will be substantial. When it comes to submissions based on the damage assessment process for that business and agriculture damage assessment, We have received 476 reports to date, still coming in consistently. So I expect that number to expand. But that's certainly representative that this was a highly devastating event for businesses along the coastline.
That's for over 470 businesses, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Pat, as you did your flyover, are you intending to do another one? And there's a question here about, was there an opportunity to assess any damage for the islands?
We didn't get out to the islands, but we've had some communications. What I've done is utilized Maine Marine Patrol to do some assessments, both on land and for the islands. And I've communicated with a few businesses on the islands. And we certainly have a lot of impacts on our offshore islands associated with working waterfront. No more plans for any more helicopter flyovers, but I'm likely going to assess some of the damages on the east side of Penobscot Bay. So we'll probably doing some traveling over the next 2 days to get a look firsthand. And but as we said, our primary focus right now in DMR is, can we identify anything in the short term to find some assistance. And so we'll be doing a lot of that with staff here over the next several days.
Great. And I'm assuming MEMA is out in communities assessing the damage right now.
At this time, we're waiting for that trickle up of information. I would expect us to be in the field in either the coming week or the next 2 weeks. But, our posture at this time is to kind of stay out of the way and let those local partners do what they need to do, aggregate the information, roll it up to the counties, who in turn roll it up to us. And we'll just kind of stand by until we're ready to bring FEMA into the state.
Yeah. Great, helpful. There are several questions here around, some communities have substantial damage and they are seasonal communities or seasonal islands. And how should they be thinking about resources? So is most of the support going to year-round residents and commercial industries? Is there relief for those seasonal communities, non-year-round residents? And I heard you say, insurance is your, kind of your first port of call, but are there other ways that they should be thinking about this?
Secondary homes are really challenging for people because going back to what I was saying before, when it comes to federal assistance, the goal of federal assistance is to assist people with the basic needs. And so it really doesn't expand as much to secondary vacation homes, seasonal homes, because it's more about focusing on those immediate needs, immediate life safety. So unfortunately, I don't have the best answer for that circumstance. And it is really hurtful for a lot of people, but being realistic, again, insurance is the biggest thing for any homeowner. However, if there is a rental component to these homes, I would encourage the landlord to fill out the business and agriculture damage assessment. When we bring SBA, Small Business Administration, into the state, that's the one Heather was speaking about before, that will offer theoretically offer the low interest disaster loans to disaster survivors and businesses. That's probably going to be the best avenue for financial support if that's a necessity for any given individual homeowner or family.
Okay, that's helpful. I think the last question we'll take here really relates to not the physical toll of the disaster, but really the mental toll this is taking, the potential loss of income over the summer. There's a long tail to this. And I'm wondering what resources are available for mental health support during this time.
Commissioner, I'll defer to you first.
Well, no, I was just going to say, here at the department, we don't have any type of resources like that. I do know There are some organizations out there, NAMI and others, that can provide some support if that type of support is needed. We certainly, I mean, obviously, going forward, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, which is problematic for many. I think one of the heartening things that I've seen on the ground is how communities have been coming together and assessing the situation and helping on the ground. And we're seeing some partnerships with wharves and other type of things. So certainly. We're a pretty hardy, resilient bunch up here in the state, and so we're hoping that everybody can lean on each other for the support. But that mental health support, certainly, I think NAMI would be a very good place to go. And I know Maine Coast Fishermen's Association has a program there as well, and industry should not hesitate to reach out to them for that type of support and understanding.
Great. Heather Ann, anything else on mental health support?
I think in time, there's, pathways we might be able to pursue through FEMA potentially for assistance through something called crisis counseling. But again, that's pretty far off. That's down the road. As far as right now, I'd recommend reaching out to the American Red Cross, and they do offer some mental health disaster services, and they'd be happy to assist there. I'm sure there are actually more, and I'd love to lean into my team to compile a list for you, Kim, to provide and disseminate accordingly. Mental health is extraordinarily important. And we certainly have our community after these events happen, and, we're astounded, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there's also a lot of life-changing hurt from these events. So I recognize there's a need for these resources, and I'd be happy to send a list of resources over to you so you can distribute it accordingly.
That would be great, and we'll make sure to get those out. In the time that we have remaining, I thought I would just go back to you and see if there's anything else that you think folks should know, or questions that I didn't ask that you would like to answer. And then I've got just a few closing comments beyond that. I did want to say there are a lot of questions we couldn't get to today. We've collected those. We'll do our best to aggregate those, get answers out to everyone. But just in terms of closing comments, Commissioner Johnson, why don't I turn to you first?
Okay, thanks, Kim. And thanks to you, Kim, and the Island Institute for hosting this discussion. It feels, I think, frustrating that there aren't a ton of answers at this stage, but I think it's really good to start the dialogue to make sure that, as much information as there is can get out, and the questions are coming in so that we can start compiling, very specific resources and get them in places that are useful for businesses and communities. I will say one of the other things, if you look through the Q&A list here and that we're getting calls on, there are also a lot of people that are available to help. And so, we talk a lot about federal resources and financial resources. I think there are a lot of options for people who want to get involved and be supportive of their local communities and local businesses. And so kind of being able to make those connections in a valuable way. And maybe Anne will talk about the volunteer program when she closes out. But I would say if you have resources that you want to contribute or you want to be helpful, that's really important too. And we appreciate that. We've seen that in the river flooding and in other coastal storms. So don't hesitate with that. People need help. And that's a way to get it maybe a little bit quicker than some of the federal resources.
Yeah.
So
thank you for mentioning that.
And we will kind of stay in touch and continue to get information out as soon as we have more.
Perfect. Commissioner Keliher, any kind of closing thoughts?
No, I think Commissioner Johnson hit the highlights. I think and we can't just reiterate enough, filling out the forms and getting the forms in as quickly as possible. I know sometimes those forms seem counterintuitive from a commercial fishing standpoint, but giving us the fact that you're reporting and getting information in through the counties back up to MEMA is critically important right now, probably the most important thing we can do. from a DMR standpoint, as we pull additional information in, our communications director will be doing updates through our website and through our Gov delivery directly to anybody who is a licensed harvester or dealer. So we'll continue to push information out that way. And lastly, my last bit of advice, which is probably the hardest to take right now, is try to be patient, because the state process takes time, but the federal process is incredibly intensive, and it does drag on a bit. So we ask for people to try to remain as patient as they can in the face of this disaster, so we can do the work that we need to do to try to get a disaster declaration in place, and more importantly, funded.
Thank you. And Anne, any closing thoughts from MEMA?
Yeah, I think Commissioner Johnson brought up a fantastic point to kind of close things out on a high note. Part of emergency management is, networking and partnership. So when things like this happen, you know who to call in. And a lot of the leaning we do for immediate needs is with a group called VOAD, Maine VOAD, which is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. So it's Good Shepherd Food Bank, Team Rubicon, Southern Baptist Church, and all these different groups have specialties, if you will, which if there's an identified need within those damage assessments, we have a dedicated person within our team, Kelsey Prakes. She's our state individual assistance officer, who's going through and kind of monitoring if there's a need that we can effectively meet with these VOAD teams. And what she'll do is she'll reach out to a county director and say, this is what I'm seeing from these assessments. What do you think about bringing in this resource to assist this community with this, whether it be muck outs, whether it be tarping roofs, whether it be mold remediation, actually cutting out drywall and insulation because it got damaged in the flood, things like that. We do have volunteer organizations ready to assist as long as they have the staffing. So again, I'll put that last plug in there. As long as we're able to see that these are needs by way of that damage assessment, that's how we can effectively kind of close those resource gaps, both immediately and through that kind of slow government process, which is, bound to take a couple months to actually bring federal relief into the state.
Great, thank you. So while we are looking for the federal resources, which are some time away, looking at what the volunteer resources are and other kinds of resources immediately, and that connection is through your office, right? And
it can go a couple different ways. I mean, we always encourage people to work with their towns directly, and that information will trickle up to us. The town will work with the county might make the request themselves. Alternatively, we're also monitoring on the state side, and we're communicating back down to our county partners as well. So we're all in that loop together, coordinating as a team to meet those identified resource needs.
great. And just another resource, I did want to share that Island Institute is expanding our longstanding business resilience grant program to support businesses that are directly affected and connected to the working waterfront, aquaculture, and fisheries. These are grants to help with storm recovery. There's more information on our website around that. So just another resource that's out there with folks. So with that, I just want to say thank you all so much. Thank you, Commissioner Johnson, Commissioner Keliher, and Anne Fuchs for joining us today. Be on the lookout, everyone, for the recording. We are going to circulate that as quickly as possible. After the discussion today, we will be sharing the FAQs with questions that we didn't get to today. Thank you all so much for joining us as you go about recovery and reconstruction. Please be safe and know that there are resources here to support you. So with that, thank you all very much. There's a slide here that will show some additional information that we have that can point you in the right direction. So stay safe on this snowy day. And again, thank you to our panelists so very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.